So I tried to think of something that we could do that reflects some of the research that we're involved in, but also something that you could apply directly in your own classroom. And if any of you are online, you can follow this now if you want and use the resources that I'm about to show you. But it's a way of bringing students through this. And it's done for two reasons. The first I want to talk about is this notion of the democratization of science data and how we can introduce that democratization into our classroom environment. And the second element is that decolonial element, especially when we begin to start talking about climate change in the context of what is happening in terms of the rapid nature of climate change within our contemporary society. But how do we decolonialise that? How do we begin to start addressing the much realer problems that exist across the global south than maybe what we're necessarily dealing with here in the global north? So, what I want to try and do in the three primary objectives is to begin to start positioning our understandings of change very much within the context of the global south. Begin to start looking at the much more dynamic processes of change that are happening, and especially within the context of the sub-Saharan world. And look at the reality of what this has for the people who are living in those environments. But the second aspect of this is providing you with a set of resources that you can use within your own classroom environment, where your students can produce and analyse data in real time, using big data, using the democratised data that we'll look at in a second. And then to begin to start questioning those correlations, the very general correlations that we're seeing in the media at the moment. Climate change is causing conflict. Climate change is causing migration. Climate change is causing war. The next big war will be about water. Are those positions necessarily true? And I think once we begin to start looking at some of these data from an integrated perspective, we can begin to start questioning those correlations to a much greater extent. So if we start looking at the hypotheses that are still very much in vogue, and we start with Homer Dixon back in 1999, who posited that as we move into a position of increased scarcity, scarcity of resources, and by scarcity of resources here we're talking about water, we're talking about soils, we're talking about agricultural land, that these scarcities combined with exponential population growth and combined with inequalities built into resource access, that this in turn will lead to scarcity. And scarcity in turn will lead to two-pronged approaches or two-pronged responses. The first is forced migration and the second is conflict. So a relatively simplistic approach towards this notion that as we live in a more inequitable world, as our resources become much more scarcer, human society, especially across the global south, will respond either by migrating or falling back into conflict. So let's begin to start testing some of this. And the primary source that we're now using for the most part within geography for much of the analysis that we're doing is Climate Engine. Climate Engine, readily accessible and freely available to all educators. This is a Google platform, but it is using all of the meteorological data, scientific data, satellite data, climate and hydrology data that is available through NOAA and various other global north organisations. And they have uploaded all of this material and it is now free to use. Now, this is not just a static entity. You don't go into Climate Engine and see a feed of data. You can interrogate Climate Engine. You can use Climate Engine and you can extract data from it. It's a very simple registration process. Any one of your students can register with their Google account and any one of you can do the same. And Climate Engine should automatically recognise your educational email address as well in terms of the schools that you're from. This is the home page when you come into Climate Engine and you're met with this feed of data. And it takes a while. It's not necessarily intuitive. It takes a bit of while to work your way around it. But I'll just talk you through some of the primary features in the context of the Horn of Africa and how we can use it here. The first homepage that you'll see, you come in and you're taken to America, and it's because it's NOAA data. But all you need to do is click onto the map and scroll across to any region in the world where you're interested in extracting the data from. And what we're interested in here is trying to understand migration and conflict within the context of the Horn of Africa. So we've travelled over to northeast Kenya, bordering Somalia, and most of us will be familiar with this, and most of our students will probably be familiar with this area as well, in the context of the myriad of media reports that are generated associated with this place. So it should be identifiable to them. Now, once you go into your area, you've got a choice. You can use point data, or you can draw a polygon around your actual space. I just used point data here because if you're doing this in your classroom environment, the amount of data that's generated if you produce a polygon can overwhelm their individual PCs. So for the most part, they're best using point data. And to be honest, the point data that they're generating from these particular places is probably as relevant as a small polygon. So you go in, you pick your point, and normally your point is a representative sample of that area. Now, the other advantage of using a point over a polygon is, for the most part, when we're dealing with Africa and many parts of the Middle East and Southeast Asia, the data tends to be a bit more generalized. And if you are dealing with North America, where they have far higher resolution data on a local basis, then you can use a polygon. That's probably more relevant in this context. But the point data is probably as relevant in this area. Now, you then have a choice. We have picked our point data here, and I have, it'll take a while to go through this, but just scroll down, see your options. I have chosen to make a graph, and the reasons for that is we'll come back to this in a second. You can choose to make a map or a graph. What we're interested in is long-term data. So long-term data is much better expressed in a graph rather than spatially coloured on a map, for example. And I'm specifically interested in climate and hydrology. I'm specifically interested in GridMet data and the variable around precipitation. Now, as we'll see, there are multiple data sources and multiple variables that you can use, but we'll focus in the first instance on precipitation. So once I've decided and I've clicked all of those variables, I literally click make a graph, and the graph is generated in about 20 to 30 seconds for me, processing those data. Now, one of the things that I've done here is you can do this on any period, but normally what I'll do when we're trying to get that long-term, that long durée image or picture, I'll pick the entire period of the data set. So there is precipitation data available from 1958 to December 2021 for this particular region. And we can download these data straight into Excel, and we can play around with them in any way that we want. But almost immediately, one of the things that you'll see is that there is a slight rise in the level of precipitation within an East African context. So rainfall is actually increasing in parts of East Africa. Now again, this gives you an insight or an opportunity to present the overt generalization that tends to be presented around climate change to our students. In some parts of the world, changing climate isn't necessarily a bad thing. We need to be area specific, but we also need to be science-led on this. And we'll see that there are a couple of outcomes as a direct consequence of this. But in general, for the moment, we're seeing within this democratized data that's freely available to us from 1958 through till 2021, we get a very accurate representation, this is temperature data, a very accurate representation of temperature coming through. So in a similar way to precipitation, which we'll look at in a second, maximum temperature has gradually increased. Now, maximum temperature increasing, you can also do this for minimum temperature, for average temperature, for mean temperature. There are multiple ways with which you can interpret these data. But you can see a very strong, gradual increase, which is representative in real terms of at least 0.5 to 0.7 degree in real terms. So temperature has changed in real terms across East Africa in this way. So a very real insight into the actualities of climate and environment change across this particular region. The second data set that we're using, so I've changed my variables. I've gone into remote sensing. I'm using Landsat data, satellite data, to look at NDVI, Normalized Difference Vegetation Index. And as we know, this is basically a good indicator of how green vegetation is. So the greener vegetation is, the more successful that environment is. You know, that's a generalized way of looking at it. But for the most part, that's what we're thinking about here. So if an area is very green, then for the most part it's doing well. If an area is very brown, you know, it's indicative of the opposite and it gets a lower NDVI value. Now, when we begin to start looking at, and we'll look at the reasons behind some of this in a second, we're seeing that period from 1990 through till about 2011 as showing low NDVI values. And we'll see in a second that this is a period of marked drought across the Horn of Africa, again associated with that increase in temperature. So we're seeing a drop in NDVI values. But one of the interesting things that we're seeing in the last 10 years is an increase in NDVI. So there's an improvement in certain parts of East Africa in terms of vegetation cover. The third data set that we're interested in, sorry I got confused at the start, but again we're picking climate and hydrology. Our data set is Terra Climate, and we're looking at our variable as precipitation. And again we're looking at the entire record of the data set, which dates from 1958 onwards. We look at precipitation. Precipitation within this region is problematic, as we know, but for the most part it correlates to some of the previous diagrams that we're looking at. A drop, apart from one or two anomalies, a drop in precipitation in and around the 1990s and early 2000s. But then an intensification of precipitation as we close in the second decade of the 20th century, which corresponds again to that rise in NDVI values. Now, when we look at these and we correlate, that's our robotic windows. I think they're on a sensor that they detect students beginning to start, losing the lecture, and they open, you get a blast of air in, everybody goes, and then you're woken back up again. These are the periods of drought. So what we've done is taken maximum temperature, NDVI values, and precipitation, and looked for correlations across each of these. This is the major famine of 1984, associated with Live Aid. These are the major droughts and famines that hit the Horn of Africa in the early 1990s. The very significant drought that hit the Horn of Africa in 2011, late 2010, 2011. And now, from 2021 onwards, we're seeing a significant deterioration in societal well-being and new drought hitting that area, and we're now in famine conditions in parts of southern Somalia and parts of northeast Kenya. So a strong correlation between environmental and climatic downturn and how society is responding. And you can really clearly see those dips in terms of the values as drought hits, and then we see an associated collapse in food security across these areas. All of this can be easily generated by your students, as I said. It can all be downloaded into Excel. They can process these data in any way they want, either producing graphs or by producing maps. Now, let's begin to start looking. So theoretically then, there is a direct correlation between drought, between environmental downturn, and famine and societal response, negative response. Theoretically. Let's then begin to start looking too at conflict data. This is a second major data source that we use. Again, highly democratized data available here. This is the UCDP, the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, which has collected data on conflict-related deaths since the 1970s. So you can go into any country in the world and you will get a detailed breakdown on conflict within those countries or within that country. You will get a full spatial data set associated with conflict mortality. And you will also get qualitative data, a full analysis of the geopolitical context and the political circumstances which underpin that conflict. Now, one of the things that I would say is the Uppsala data set, and all of these will be sent to you, so you'll have all of these links and you'll be able to follow this in real time. The one thing that I would say about the Uppsala data set is that it only deals with conflict mortality. There are a number of other data sets like ACLED, which also deals with conflict injury and conflict events. So it's a much more rounded view of what's going on within a conflict context. But there are multiple data sets and we'll send you all of these. And again, this is free to access. Your students can access these data, access this resource, and they can play around and download these data in any format they want, either graphically or spatially. So again, we're coming into the area that we've selected for our point data. This is northeast Kenya. It gives us our number of conflict deaths. These data are available in this country from 1989 through till 2021. But once you go into the country profile, you get that spatial distribution. And as you interrogate each one of these locations, you'll get the details of the conflict, the sides of the conflict, the actors in that conflict, and their spatial and socioeconomic data associated with that. So, for example, we go into the exact point that we were on in the northeast of the country, which is Marsabit country, and this is very much about pastoral conflict. And pastoral conflict associated with migration, pastoral conflict associated with the movement of peoples through this particular landscape. But the Uppsala data set will not only provide you with all of the data, but it will also give you extensive qualitative material and historical and geopolitical material associated with that particular conflict. So if we correlate, if we take our three environmental data sets, and we correlate those against conflict mortality, then yes, again, we look at the environmental and climatic downturn in the early 90s, a significant rise in the number of deaths and conflict mortality. Again, similarly, 2011, the major downturn that happens at this stage, a very significant rise in conflict mortality at this stage. So all of the correlations here seem to be matching. We then begin to start thinking about migration, how society is responding to this. So we posited it at the start of this talk that society responds in two ways. Society migrates in these fragile regions, but society also descends into conflict. It looks as if there's a correlation of descending into conflict, but how does the migration pattern look? Again, another open access data source. These data are coming from the World Bank. Again, freely available. And you can click on any country in the world to get refugee data, internal migration data. And, we know the complexities around movement. We know all of that. But at the moment, we're dealing with general access, general data sources associated with this type of activity. So this is refugee populations and refugee movement within Kenya. Very little data from 1970 through till 1990. The world really only woke up to mapping refugee and movement from the 1990s onwards. But again, when we begin to start mapping our primary events, the drought and the climatic downturn of the 1990s, very significant rise in internal refugees, drops off But again, the major drought of 2011, very significant rise in migratory movement and refugee populations. And again, now as we're moving into a new crisis across the region, we're seeing an uptick in the amount of movement and refugee activity happening across all those areas. We can correlate that across the rest of the region. These are all of the countries of sub-Saharan Africa, and we see a very similar picture happening across much of the region. You know, there are country differences, there are local differences, again associated with the geopolitical instances in those areas. But one of the best data sources for this is at the bottom of the screen, the UNHCR's refugee statistics, which map very closely refugee movement and refugee activity across the globe. And again, much of this is associated with this particular context. We know the region that we're interested in is dominated by pastoral and transhumance activity. We know there is significant migratory movement. We know there is contestation between pastoralist and nomadic groups, all within the context of a deteriorating political situation. So theoretically, there's a correlation. Theoretically, there's a correlation between weather declining, environment declining, conflict and migration. But if we think about the summers, especially the summers over the last maybe 25, 30 years within the context of Northern Ireland, there has been a significant uptick in violence during the months of July and August. July in particular. Now, are we as geographers saying that that uptick in violence is associated with the good weather of July? And therein lies the problem. So it's at this point that you can begin to step back from this and really begin to start pushing your students to think much more about data. Data, as we know, can be used in any way. Data can be manipulated. Data can be presented to support any type of ideology, and God knows there's some horrible ideologies being supported by that, and we'll hear about some of that later on. So, can we, and we go in and we look at those data. We look at the PSNI's data, their security situation statistics, again, freely available right back to the 1960s. And if we were to correlate this, there is a huge uptick in violence in Northern Ireland in July every year as our weather theoretically gets better. Now, we know that that is a massively simplistic way of looking at it. So in the same context, is this our overly simplistic way of looking at the global south? Their weather is getting worse, or better, however we want to look at it. Global warming is coming in, they've less, vegetation is collapsing, therefore they respond in that particular way. That to me is a hugely simplistic way of looking at this. So it's getting your students to begin to start thinking in a much deeper way about the realities of what's happening here. So when we begin to start introducing qualitative material, and in each of those data sets that we've looked at, with the exception of Climate Engine, there are a series of qualitative data associated with that activity, especially with the UN migration body, and especially with the World Bank. Although sometimes the World Bank data has to be approached with a degree of caution. But when we look at the actual qualitative data associated with conflict in this region, we see other causation factors. And very rarely during any qualitative survey do we see the communities of this region blaming environment or climate change. What does come across is a very strong sense of social global injustice. That climate is changing, but it's not us who have caused climate to change. But instead, when they begin to start highlighting the core causes of conflict, they lie in other places. And I'm conscious I'm coming towards the end now, but from a qualitative perspective, time and time again, when we analyse conflict in these places, it's much more about fragility. The fragility of the political system, the fragility of the states that they're living in, and the structural inequalities that are embedded within those societies. The notion of othering, the notion of in-groups and out-groups, the dominance of particular entities who control resource access, the structural deficiencies that exist in various states that mean certain groups are excluded from societal norms. So it is the way states are structured, are not structured, that is much more likely to result in conflict than an increase or a decrease in temperature, for example. Identity-based conflict, how complex is that? And Sarah will talk much more about that in a second, or later on this morning. But identity-based conflicts and what we term age-old enmities are also an intrinsic part of this process as well. So they're conflict data and qualitative data. But when we begin to start looking at the qualitative data associated with migration, we're seeing an almost identical process. Time and time again, when the United Nations Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre interviews these folks, does their analysis, we see that the vast majority of displacement crises are result as political blockages, are essentially failing states, are structurally unequal states. It's not, again, about climate and environment necessarily. It's about the inability of their home states to be able to protect and support their peoples. So when we begin to start looking at how these groups report themselves, we see that state fragility, weak governance, corruption, prioritisation of economic interests, discrimination, social exclusion, all of the things that we see coming out as the causation factors of conflict are being replicated when it comes to the migratory picture as well. And when you begin to start hearing local voices in Kenya, Ethiopia and Somalia, for example, almost invariably when you interview these pastoralists about the reasons for their crisis, they report economic inequalities and social exclusion as the primary reason why they migrate. Not necessarily are not associated with climate or drought. So, just in very quick summary then, we recognise and we can very clearly see in our data that climate and environment are undergoing very significant and very rapid change. Giving your students access to this democratised data allows them to interrogate that in a very real way and allows them to play around with those data in a very real way. And we recognise that, yes, climate and environment change is contributing to the very significant issues impacting upon this area, but it's not the sole cause of conflict and migration. And I think that becomes one of the key takeaway messages from today. It's a contributing factor, but it's not the sole cause. So as I said, all of these are available to you. And Paul, I think, will send them on as a PowerPoint and as a PDF once the session is finished.